The desperate wail of the church organ seemed to cry out in protest as Josephine Palmer stood frozen at the altar, her trembling hands clutching a bouquet of wilting roses. It was 1878 in Florissant, Colorado, and at 20 years old, Josephine was about to be married to the most feared man in the territory, a marriage arranged by her father to settle debts that threatened to swallow their family whole. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, painting kaleidoscope patterns across the wooden floor of the small church. Josephine could feel sweat beading beneath her cream-colored wedding dress, the fabric suddenly too tight, too heavy. She stole a glance at her soon-to-be husband, Victor Blackman, whose cold eyes remained fixed on the preacher. At 45, Blackman's face was weathered and scarred, his reputation for brutality well earned through years of land grabbing, intimidation, and violence that had earned him control of half the valley. If anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined together in matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace, the preacher announced, his voice echoing through the church. The silence that followed was deafening. Josephine's heart sank. No one would dare oppose Blackman. Her father sat in the front pew, his expression a mixture of resignation and shame. He couldn't meet her eyes. Then, as if answering her silent prayers, the church doors burst open with a thunderous crash. Sunlight poured in, momentarily blinding the congregation as a tall figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. "I object," came a deep voice, steady and certain. Gasps filled the church as everyone turned. Josephine squinted against the light. The man stepped forward, spurs jingling with each deliberate step down the aisle. She recognized him immediately: Flynn Jackson, a cowboy who worked for the neighboring Clayton Ranch. They had spoken only a few times in town, but there was something in his eyes that had always lingered in her memory. Victor Blackman's hand moved to his holster. "This doesn't concern you, boy." Flynn's gaze never wavered from Josephine's face. "Miss Palmer doesn't want this marriage. Anyone with eyes can see that." "This is outrageous." Josephine's father stood, face flushing red. "You have no right to interfere in family matters." Flynn ignored him, moving closer until he stood just feet from Josephine. His blue eyes locked with hers, asking a question without words. Behind him, several of Blackman's men were already moving down the aisle. "Miss Palmer," Flynn said quietly, extending his hand. "I can't offer you much, but I can offer you a choice." Blackman lunged forward, grabbing Josephine's arm. "She's mine now. The agreement is signed." The pain of his grip made Josephine wince, and something inside her snapped. All the fear, all the resignation that had paralyzed her for weeks gave way to a sudden, desperate courage. Without thinking, she twisted away from Blackman and reached for Flynn's outstretched hand. "Run," Flynn whispered, and they did. Chaos erupted in the church as Flynn pulled Josephine down the aisle. A shot rang out, splintering wood near their heads as they burst through the doors into the blinding afternoon sun. Flynn's horse waited outside, pawing nervously at the ground. In one fluid motion, Flynn lifted Josephine onto the saddle and swung up behind her. "Hold on," he shouted, and they were off, galloping down the dusty main street of Florissant as shouts and more gunfire erupted behind them. Josephine clung to the horse's mane, her wedding dress billowing around her, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea what would happen next, but as the wind whipped through her hair and the town receded behind them, one thing was clear: for the first time in months, she felt alive. Flynn steered them out of town toward the foothills, following trails only a local would know. They rode hard for nearly an hour, the sounds of pursuit fading behind them. Josephine's arms ached from holding on, and her wedding dress was torn and dust-covered. Eventually, Flynn slowed the horse to a walk as they entered a densely wooded area. "There's a cabin up ahead," he said, his voice close to her ear. "We can rest there, figure out what to do next." The cabin was small and rustic, clearly abandoned for some time. Flynn helped Josephine down from the horse, his hands gentle on her waist. Her legs nearly buckled beneath her, unaccustomed to such hard riding. "Are you all right?" he asked, steadying her. Josephine stared at him, the reality of what they'd done finally crashing over her. "They'll kill you for this," she whispered. "Blackman will never stop hunting us." Flynn's expression remained calm as he tied the horse to a post. "Probably, but I couldn't stand by and watch it happen." He looked at her, really looked at her, as if trying to read her thoughts. "Do you regret coming with me?" Josephine thought about the life that had awaited her with Victor Blackman, a man known for breaking both spirits and bodies. She shook her head. "No, I don't regret it, but I've dragged you into my troubles, and for that I'm sorry." Flynn's lips curved into a small smile. "Don't be sorry yet, we've got a long way to go." He gestured to the cabin. "It's not much, but it'll keep us hidden until nightfall, then we can make better time." Inside, the cabin was dusty but intact, a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed in the corner. Flynn busied himself checking the perimeter while Josephine sank onto one of the chairs, her wedding dress spreading around her like a deflated balloon. "We need to get you something else to wear," Flynn said, returning from outside. "That dress is like a beacon." Josephine looked down at herself and let out a small, almost hysterical laugh. "I never wanted to wear it in the first place." She reached up and began pulling pins from her hair, letting the carefully arranged curls fall loose around her shoulders. "How did you know? About the wedding, I mean." Flynn hesitated, then sat in the chair opposite her. "Everyone in town knew. Your father's debts to Blackman weren't exactly a secret. And he paused, a hint of color touching his tan cheeks. "I've noticed you, Miss Palmer, every time you've come into town. The way you'd look at the mountains like you were dreaming of somewhere else." Josephine felt warmth spread through her chest. "I didn't think anyone saw me at all. I saw you." The simplicity of his statement made her breath catch. A noise outside broke the moment, the distant sound of horses. Flynn was on his feet instantly, moving to the window. "They're following the main trail. We should be safe for now, but we can't stay long." Darkness fell quickly in the mountains. Flynn found an old lantern and lit it, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. He rummaged through a trunk in the corner and produced a pair of worn men's trousers, a cotton shirt, and a jacket. "These might fit if you cinch the belt tight enough," he said, handing them to Josephine. "I'll wait outside while you change." Left alone, Josephine struggled out of the wedding dress, feeling a strange sense of liberation as the garment pooled at her feet. The men's clothes were too large but infinitely more practical. She rolled up the sleeves and pant legs, tied the belt tightly around her waist, and used a strip torn from her petticoat to tie back her hair. When Flynn returned, he stopped in the doorway, staring at her transformation. "You look," he started, then smiled, like trouble. Josephine couldn't help but smile back. "I suppose I am now." They shared a meager supper of jerky and hardtack that Flynn had in his saddlebags. As they ate, Flynn outlined his plan. They would travel north, avoiding the main roads toward Denver. From there, they could catch a train east, maybe all the way to St. Louis or Chicago. "Blackman has influence," Josephine said, "but even his reach has limits. If we can get far enough away, we could start over," Flynn finished. He looked at her thoughtfully. "Is that what you want?" A new beginning, Josephine considered the question. All her life, decisions had been made for her by her father, by society, by circumstance. The idea of choosing her own path was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Yes," she said finally, "that's exactly what I want." They set out again under cover of darkness, Flynn leading the horse through dense forest to avoid leaving a clear trail. Josephine walked beside him, the men's boots he'd found for her rubbing blisters on her heels, but she didn't complain. Every step took her further from the life she'd nearly been trapped in. "Tell me about yourself, Flynn Jackson," she said quietly as they walked. "All I know is that you work for the Clayton Ranch and that you just risked your life for a woman you barely know." Flynn was silent for so long that Josephine thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Not much to tell. I was born in Missouri. Father was a farmer who lost everything in the war, came west when I was 16, worked cattle drives from Texas up to Montana for years. Settled here 2 seasons ago, he glanced at her. Your turn, Josephine smiled faintly. I was born in St. Louis, my mother died when I was 12. Father moved us west 4 years ago, chasing mining opportunities that never panned out. He started gambling, borrowing money. She trailed off. You know how that ended. Not everyone would sell their daughter to pay a debt, Flynn said, an edge to his voice. He didn't see it that way. He thought he was securing my future. Blackman is wealthy after all, she swallowed hard. But I'd heard stories about his first wife, how she fell down the stairs, and the ranch hand who crossed him and disappeared. She looked up at Flynn. Thank you for saving me from that. Flynn's expression softened. I couldn't do anything else. They traveled through the night and much of the following day, stopping only to rest the horse and catch a few hours of sleep huddled against tree trunks. By the second evening, they had covered nearly 30 miles of rough terrain, but Josephine was exhausted. Her city-bred body wasn't accustomed to such hardship. When she stumbled for the 3rd time in an hour, Flynn called a halt. There's a line shack about a mile ahead, he said. Used during the summer cattle drives, should be empty this time of year. The shack was little more than 4 walls and a roof, but it seemed like luxury to Josephine. Flynn got a small fire going in the iron stove while she collapsed onto a narrow cot in the corner. We'll rest here tonight, Flynn decided. You need sleep and the horse needs rest. He began preparing a simple meal from his dwindling supplies. Josephine watched him move around the small space, his movements economical and sure. You're good at this, she observed. Being on the run, Flynn's mouth quirked. Had some practice. Before I came to Colorado, I had a disagreement with a rancher in Wyoming. His daughter and I were sweet on each other. He didn't approve. What happened? He tried to have me horsewhipped. I left. He shrugged, but Josephine could see there was more to the story. You loved her, she asked quietly. Flynn was silent for a moment, stirring the pot of beans he had set to warm. Thought I did. Turned out she wasn't willing to choose me over her father's money. He glanced at Josephine. Sometimes I wonder if anyone ever really chooses love over security. The vulnerability in his voice touched something deep inside her. I chose freedom over security today, she said. Maybe that's a start. Flynn's eyes met hers across the small room, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. The moment was broken by a sound outside, a branch snapping beneath a heavy foot. Flynn instantly doused the lantern and moved silently to the window. Josephine's heart hammered in her chest as he peered out into the darkness. 2 riders, he whispered, moving slow. Might be looking for us, might just be passing through. Josephine joined him at the window, careful to stay in the shadows. In the moonlight, she could make out 2 mounted figures approaching the shack. One of them she recognized with a jolt of fear. It was Samuel Denton, one of Blackman's most loyal men. They've found us, she breathed. Flynn moved to his saddlebags and pulled out a revolver. Out the back, he murmured. Stay low, get to the trees. Josephine hesitated. What about you? I'll be right behind you. Go. She slipped out the back door and into the darkness, crouching low as she made her way toward the tree line. Behind her, she heard the front door of the shack crash open, followed by raised voices. Jackson, we know you're in here. Blackman wants his property back. Then came the sound of a scuffle, a gunshot that echoed through the night, and more shouting. Josephine froze, torn between running for safety and going back to help Flynn. Before she could decide, another shot rang out, followed by an eerie silence. Her heart in her throat, Josephine waited, hidden among the trees. Minutes stretched like hours. Then a figure emerged from the shack, tall and moving with a slight limp. Flynn. Relief flooded through her as he made his way to where she was hiding. Are you hurt? She whispered urgently. Just a graze, he said, his voice tight. But we need to move. Now, I managed to surprise them, but Denton got away. He'll be back with more men. What about the other one? Flynn's expression hardened. He won't be following us. Josephine didn't ask for clarification. They retrieved the horse. which Flynn had wisely tied in a sheltered gully and set off again into the night. Flynn was silent, his face grim in the moonlight, and Josephine knew he was troubled by what had happened at the shack. "It was self-defense," she said finally as they picked their way through a rocky pass. "Doesn't make it easier." Flynn's voice was low. "I'm not a killer, Josephine, never wanted to be." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and despite the circumstances, it sent a small thrill through her. "This is my fault," she said. "If I hadn't—" "Don't," Flynn interrupted. "This was my choice. I knew what I was risking when I walked into that church." He glanced at her. "I'd do it again." They pushed on through the night, the terrain growing steeper and more difficult as they climbed higher into the mountains. By dawn, they had reached a vantage point that allowed them to look back over the valley they had left behind. Florissant was barely visible in the distance, a tiny cluster of buildings dwarfed by the vastness of the landscape. "We should reach Breckenridge in 2 days if we keep this pace," Flynn said, studying the horizon. "From there, we can catch the stage to Denver." Josephine nodded, too exhausted to speak. Her hands and face were scratched from branches, her body ached from riding, and hunger gnawed at her stomach. But still, looking out over the mountains bathed in the pink light of dawn, she felt a fierce joy. This was freedom hard-earned and dangerous, but hers. They found shelter in a natural cave formed by an overhanging rock and slept for a few hours during the hottest part of the day. When Josephine woke, she found Flynn sitting at the cave entrance, whittling a piece of wood with his knife. "What are you making?" she asked, coming to sit beside him. He showed her a small, delicate flower taking shape beneath his skilled hands. "My mother taught me, said a man should be able to create beauty as well as do hard work." He smiled faintly. "She was a wise woman. She sounds wonderful." "She was." His eyes grew distant. "Lost her to typhoid when I was 14. My father was never the same after." Josephine touched his arm gently. "I'm sorry," Flynn nodded, acknowledging her sympathy. "What about your mother? What was she like? Beautiful? Kind?" Josephine smiled at the memory. "She loved to read poetry, used to recite Tennyson and Wordsworth while she did the washing. My father thought it was frivolous, but she always said beauty feeds the soul as surely as bread feeds the body." She was right. Flynn looked at her, his eyes soft. What would she think about all this? "About you running away," Josephine considered the question. "She would have been frightened for me, but I think she would have understood. She married my father for love against her parents' wishes. They disowned her for it." She sighed. "The irony is that my father, who once defied convention for love, was willing to sacrifice me for money." "People change," Flynn said. "Sometimes not for the better." They fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Finally, Flynn stood, offering Josephine his hand. "We should move, cover some more ground before nightfall." That night brought a change in the weather. Dark clouds rolled in from the west and the temperature dropped sharply. By the time they found shelter in an abandoned prospector's hut, rain was falling in heavy sheets, and distant thunder rumbled through the mountains. The hut was small but dry, with a stone fireplace that Flynn soon had blazing with wood he'd gathered before the worst of the storm hit. They hung their wet clothes near the fire and wrapped themselves in scratchy wool blankets found in an old trunk. Josephine sat close to the fire, watching the flames dance as rain pattered on the roof. Flynn rummaged through his saddlebags and produced a small flask. "Not much," he said, offering it to her, "but it'll warm you up." Josephine took a cautious sip, coughing as the whiskey burned down her throat. Flynn smiled and took the flask back, taking a longer pull before setting it aside. "How far do you think they'll chase us?" she asked after a while. Flynn stared into the fire. "Blackman doesn't strike me as a man who gives up easily, especially when his pride is hurt. And I hurt his pride by running. We both did." Flynn added another log to the fire. "But Denver's a big city, easy to disappear there, and if we keep going east." He trailed off, looking at her. Unless you had somewhere else in mind, Josephine realized she hadn't thought that far ahead. In the chaos of escape, she'd focused only on getting away, not on where she was going. I don't know, she admitted. I have an aunt in Boston, but I haven't seen her since I was a child. I'm not sure she'd even remember me. What would you do? If you could do anything, the question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that before. I'd like to teach, I think. I've always loved books like my mother, or maybe open a small shop of some kind. She looked at him curiously. What about you? What would you do if you weren't running cattle for someone else? Flynn was quiet for a moment. I've been saving for a piece of land, something small but mine. Enough for a few horses, maybe some cattle. He met her eyes across the fire. Somewhere to put down roots. The intimacy of the moment, the storm raging outside, the fire crackling between them, the sharing of dreams long held private stirred something in Josephine's chest. She found herself looking at Flynn differently, noticing the strong line of his jaw, the kindness in his eyes, the gentle strength in his hands. Thank you, she said suddenly. Flynn looked confused. For what? For asking me what I want. No one's ever done that before. His expression softened. Everyone deserves that much, at least. The storm continued through the night, trapping them in the hut for all of the next day. They passed the time in conversation, learning each other's stories, sharing memories and dreams. Josephine told Flynn about the books she'd loved as a girl, and he taught her how to play poker with a battered deck of cards he found in his saddlebag. By the time the rain finally stopped the following morning, something had shifted between them, a growing comfort, a deepening trust. They set out again under clearing skies, making good progress along muddy trails that wound through pine forests and across high meadows bright with wildflowers. Flynn seemed to know the mountains intimately, finding paths that kept them hidden from the main trails while still moving steadily northward. Late in the afternoon of their 5th day on the run, they crested a ridge and saw Breckenridge spread out below them, a bustling mining town nestled in a valley, with smoke rising from chimneys and the sounds of civilization floating up to meet them. We'll need to be careful, Flynn warned as they began their descent. Word might have reached here ahead of us. They agreed that Josephine would wait in the woods outside town while Flynn went in alone to gather supplies and information. She watched him ride away with a strange tightness in her chest, suddenly afraid that he might not return, that he might decide this adventure had become too dangerous and leave her to fend for herself. But 2 hours later he was back, his horse loaded with supplies. The stage for Denver leaves tomorrow morning, he reported. I've bought us tickets under false names, and I got you these. He handed her a bundle containing a simple dress, boots that actually fit, and a shawl. Thought you might be tired of those clothes. Josephine held the dress against herself, touched by his thoughtfulness. They're perfect, thank you. Flynn looked pleased. There's more. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper. This was posted in the Mercantile. Josephine unfolded it to find a crude wanted poster. 2 rough sketches, one of Flynn, one of her stared back at her, along with the promise of a $500 reward for information leading to their capture. The paper trembled in her hands. It's not a very good likeness of you, Flynn said, trying to lighten the mood. They've got your nose all wrong. Despite herself, Josephine laughed. Yours isn't much better. They've made you look at least 60 years old. Flynn smiled, but then grew serious. This changes things, though. We'll need to be even more careful in town. I've found us a place to stay tonight, a widow who rents rooms on the edge of town. Keeps to herself, doesn't ask questions. The widow, Mrs. Holbrook, was indeed discreet, showing them to a small room at the back of her house without comment about their travel-worn appearance or lack of luggage. The room had a single bed, a washstand, and a chair. I'll sleep on the floor, Flynn said immediately when Mrs. Holbrook had gone. Josephine nodded, suddenly shy. Despite the days spent in close quarters, this felt different, more intimate, more real than huddling for warmth in a cave or shack. She washed in the basin provided, grateful to scrub away the dust of the trail, then changed into the new dress. It was plain but clean and fit her reasonably well. When she emerged from behind the screen in the corner, Flynn's eyes widened. You look. He started, then cleared his throat. It suits you. Josephine felt herself blushing under his gaze. Thank you for getting it. They ate a simple meal provided by Mrs. Holbrook, fresh bread, cheese, and stewed apples sitting across from each other at a small table. For the first time in days, Josephine felt almost normal, as if they were just two people enjoying a quiet evening together rather than fugitives with a price on their heads. Tell me more about this land you want to buy, she said as they finished eating. Where would it be? Flynn leaned back in his chair. I've had my eye on a place north of here, near the Wyoming border. It's good grazing land with a creek running through it and mountains to the west that shelter it from the worst storms. His eyes grew animated as he described it. There's a stand of aspen that turns gold in the fall and a natural meadow that fills with wildflowers come spring. It sounds beautiful, Josephine said softly. It is. He looked at her thoughtfully. What about you? Where would you settle if you could choose anywhere? Josephine considered the question. I've always loved the mountains. The way the light changes on them throughout the day, the smell of pine in the air. She smiled. Somewhere like that, I think. Somewhere with space to breathe, Flynn nodded, understanding in his eyes. Not too many people. Just the right ones, she agreed, the moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Flynn's gaze dropped to her lips, then quickly away. He stood, breaking the tension. We should get some rest. Stage leaves early. Josephine nodded, her heart beating faster than it should. She watched as Flynn made a pallet on the floor with extra blankets Mrs. Holbrook had provided, then slipped into the narrow bed herself. The lamp was extinguished, leaving the room in darkness save for the moonlight filtering through the curtains. Flynn, she whispered after a while. Yes. Are you afraid of what happens next? There was a long pause before he answered. Not afraid, cautious, we're not out of danger yet. But we will be, eventually. Yes, he said, his voice soft in the darkness. We will be. Josephine closed her eyes, comforted by his certainty, and soon drifted into the first truly restful sleep she'd had in days. Morning came too soon, with a light knock on the door and Mrs. Holbrook's voice announcing that breakfast was ready. They ate quickly, Flynn going over the plan once more. They would board the stage separately, pretending not to know each other until they were well away from Breckenridge. The story is that you're a young widow traveling to Denver to stay with relatives, he reminded her. I'm a ranch hand looking for work. Simple, easy to remember. Josephine nodded, trying to quell the nervousness that fluttered in her stomach. And once we reach Denver, we'll find somewhere to stay while I figure out how to get us east. Train would be fastest, but they might be watching the station. He hesitated. Josephine, if at any point you want to, go your own way, just say so. I understand that this isn't what you signed up for. She looked at him in surprise. Do you want me to leave? No, he said quickly. That's not what I meant. I know this isn't easy running like this, and I dragged you into it. You saved me, she corrected him, and I'm not going anywhere without you. The certainty in her own voice surprised her. Flynn's expression softened, and for a moment, Josephine thought he might say something more. Instead, he simply nodded. We should go. Stage will be loading soon. They said goodbye to Mrs. Holbrook, who pressed a small package of food into Josephine's hands with a knowing smile, and made their way separately to the stagecoach office in the center of town. Josephine went first, keeping her head down and her shawl pulled close around her face. The stage was already loading when she arrived, a sturdy Concorde coach with 6 passengers already aboard. She handed her ticket to the agent and was about to climb in when a voice called out behind her. Miss, wait. Josephine froze, her heart in her throat. Slowly, she turned to see a young boy running toward her, waving something in his hand. You dropped this, miss, he said, holding out a handkerchief that wasn't hers. Relief washed over her. Thank you, but I'm afraid that isn't mine. The boy looked confused. But the man said, a commotion from across the street interrupted him. Josephine looked up to see 2 men on horseback thundering into town, one of them unmistakably Samuel Denton. As she watched in horror, they pulled up outside the general store where Flynn had just emerged. There was a moment of terrible stillness as Flynn and Denton spotted each other simultaneously. Then Flynn dropped the packages he was carrying and ran, ducking between buildings as Denton shouted and spurred his horse after him. Josephine didn't think she simply acted, hiking up her skirts and running in the direction Flynn had disappeared, ignoring the startled cries of the stagecoach passengers. She heard gunshots from somewhere ahead and ran faster, her heart pounding in her ears. She rounded a corner to find herself in a narrow alley between two buildings. At the far end, Flynn was grappling with Denton, both men fighting for control of a pistol. The second man lay on the ground, clutching his leg. Without hesitation, Josephine grabbed a piece of firewood from a nearby stack and ran forward, bringing it down hard on Denton's head. He crumpled to the ground, the gun falling from his grasp. Flynn stared at her in shock. "Josephine, we need to go," she said urgently. "Now." They ran together through a maze of back alleys, emerging on the outskirts of town near the livery stable. Flynn quickly saddled his horse while Josephine kept watch. "The stage is leaving," she said, watching the coach roll out of town in the distance. "We've missed it. Doesn't matter. They'd be looking for us on it now anyway." Flynn finished with the saddle and led the horse out. "We'll have to find another way to Denver." They rode double out of Breckenridge, taking a little-used trail that wound through dense forest. Once they were well away from town, Flynn slowed the horse to a walk. "That was reckless," he said, though there was admiration in his voice. "You could have been hurt." "So could you," she countered. "I wasn't going to just stand there and watch." Flynn shook his head, but she could feel him chuckle. "Remind me never to underestimate you, Josephine Palmer." They rode in silence for a while, each processing the narrow escape. Josephine, seated behind Flynn with her arms around his waist, found herself acutely aware of his proximity, the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "What now?" she asked finally. "There's a settlement about 20 miles north Georgetown. Smaller than Breckenridge, might be safer. We can try to catch the Denver stage from there." He glanced back at her. "Are you all right to keep riding?" Josephine nodded. "I'm fine." But by the time they reached Georgetown late the following day, it was clear they had a problem. News of the confrontation in Breckenridge had traveled faster than they had, and new wanted posters were already displayed in the town's small sheriff's office. "We need to change our appearance," Flynn decided as they camped in the woods outside town. "And our names." They used the last of their money to purchase supplies from a farm on the outskirts of Georgetown, including scissors, hair dye, and new clothes. That night, by the light of their campfire, Josephine cut Flynn's hair short and helped him dye it a darker shade with a mixture made from walnut hulls. He looked strange to her afterward, still handsome, but different, harder to recognize. "Your turn," he said, taking the scissors. Josephine hesitated, touching her long brown hair. "How short does it need to be?" Flynn's expression softened. "Not too short, just enough to change how you look." He moved behind her. "Trust me," she nodded, closing her eyes as she felt the first strands fall. When it was done, her hair fell just below her shoulders in loose waves, and Flynn had used the same dye to darken it to nearly black. "How do I look?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. Flynn's eyes traveled over her face. "Beautiful," he said simply. "Different, but still you." The compliment warmed her from the inside out. As they sat by the fire that night, planning their next move, Josephine found herself watching Flynn, the way the firelight played across his features, the careful consideration he gave to every detail of their journey. In the days since their escape from Florissant, he had shown her nothing but kindness, courage, and respect. "Why did you really do it?" she asked suddenly. "Come into the church that day." Flynn looked up, surprised by the question. "I told you, you said you couldn't stand by and watch." "But why? You barely knew me." He was quiet for a long moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "I saw you in town about a month before the wedding," he said finally. "You were at the general store looking at a book of poetry. Your father came in, angry about something, and ordered you to put it back." Flynn's eyes met hers across the fire. "The look on your face when you set that book down like something precious was being taken away. It stayed with me." Josephine remembered that day her father had been furious because she'd been late meeting him, too absorbed in Wordsworth to notice the time passing. When I heard about the arranged marriage to Blackman, Flynn continued, I kept thinking about that look. About how someone like you shouldn't be caged. He shrugged, seemingly embarrassed by his admission. It wasn't right, that's all. Josephine moved around the fire to sit beside him. Slowly, giving him time to pull away if he wanted, she reached for his hand. Thank you, she said softly. For seeing me, really seeing me. Flynn's fingers tightened around hers. For a breathless moment, Josephine thought he might kiss her, wanted him to kiss her, she realized with sudden clarity. Instead, he gently squeezed her hand and stood. We should get some sleep, he said. Long ride tomorrow. They traveled for 3 more days, keeping to back trails and avoiding settlements. They spoke of many things during those long hours on horseback. Flynn told Josephine about the cattle drives he'd been on, the vast open spaces of Montana, the stars over the Texas Panhandle. She shared memories of St. Louis, of books she'd read, of the dreams she'd had before her life had narrowed to mere survival. Something was growing between them, a connection deeper than the circumstances that had thrown them together. Josephine found herself noticing small things about Flynn, the way he always made sure she ate before he did, how he whistled softly when lost in thought, the gentleness with which he treated their tired horse. On the 4th day, they reached a high ridge that offered a spectacular view of Denver in the distance, spread out across the plains with the mountains rising behind it. We made it, Josephine breathed, taking in the sight of the city larger than any she'd seen since leaving St. Louis. Flynn nodded, though his expression remained cautious. Almost. We'll need to be careful in the city. More people means more eyes. They made camp one last time in the foothills, planning to enter Denver the following morning. After a simple dinner, they sat side by side watching the distant lights of the city twinkle in the gathering darkness. What happens after Denver? Josephine asked quietly. Flynn glanced at her. That depends on you, I suppose. We could keep going east like we planned. Or. She prompted. When he didn't continue, he took a deep breath. I've been thinking about that land I told you about, near the Wyoming border. It's remote, peaceful. Blackman would never find us there. Josephine's heart quickened. Us? Flynn met her eyes, vulnerability plain on his face. I know it hasn't been long, and I know this all started with me just trying to help you escape. But Josephine. He took her hand. These past days, getting to know you, your strength, your kindness, your dreams, I've come to care for you, more than I thought possible. Josephine felt tears spring to her eyes. I care for you too, she whispered. Flynn reached up to touch her cheek. I can't offer you much, a hard life in a wild place, but it would be yours to choose freely. And I would spend every day trying to make you happy. Are you asking me to come with you, to stay with you? Yes, he said simply. If that's what you want. Josephine thought about the future that had nearly been forced upon her and the uncertain path that lay ahead. She thought about Flynn, his quiet strength, his unwavering respect for her choices, the way her heart seemed to recognize something in him that it had been searching for all along. Yes, she said, her voice clear and certain. That's what I want. The look of joy that transformed Flynn's face made her breath catch. Slowly, he leaned forward, giving her time to pull away if she wished. Instead, Josephine closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that felt like a promise, like coming home. They entered Denver the next morning, Flynn's arm protective around Josephine's shoulders as they made their way through the bustling streets. The city was a shock after days in the wilderness, noisy, crowded, overwhelming with its brick buildings, clattering wagons, and throngs of people from all walks of life. They found lodging in a modest boarding house run by a no-nonsense widow who asked few questions beyond whether they could pay in advance. Flynn introduced them as Mr. and Mrs. Frank Johnson, newly arrived from Wyoming and looking to purchase supplies before heading to their homestead. It's safer this way, he explained privately to Josephine, apologizing for the deception. No one will question a married couple traveling together. Josephine understood the practicality, though the pretense of being Flynn's wife stirred complicated feelings. They were given a small room with a double bed that made both of them blush and avoid each other's eyes. Flynn insisted on sleeping on the floor despite Josephine's protests. Over the next 3 days, they cautiously explored Denver, always alert for signs of pursuit. Flynn sold his horse to a livery stable, using the money to purchase supplies they would need for the journey north: tools, seeds, cooking equipment, warm clothing for the coming winter. Josephine found work for a few days helping a dressmaker who was behind on orders, earning enough to contribute to their growing collection of necessities. In the evenings, they would sit in their room, planning and dreaming of the life they might build together. Flynn sketched rough plans for a cabin on scraps of paper, while Josephine made lists of seeds she wanted to plant in a garden come spring. "We'll need to build before the first snow," Flynn said one night as they pored over a map he'd purchased. "The winters are harsh that far north." "How long will it take to reach the land?" Josephine asked, tracing the route with her finger. 2 weeks, maybe more, depending on the weather. We'll need to purchase a wagon and team." He looked up at her, concern in his eyes. "It won't be an easy journey, especially with winter coming." Josephine smiled. "After everything we've been through, I think I can manage a wagon ride." Flynn reached across the table to take her hand. "You're remarkable, you know that. Most women who grew up with the comforts you had would be terrified at the prospect of frontier life." "Most women haven't had the benefit of running for their lives through the wilderness," she countered with a laugh. "It changes your perspective on what's truly important." Flynn's expression grew serious. "And what is truly important to you, Josephine?" She squeezed his hand. "Freedom, purpose." "Love," her eyes met his. "Things I've found since the day you walked into that church." The following day, as Josephine was returning to the boarding house from the dressmaker's shop, she sensed someone watching her. Keeping her head down, she quickened her pace, heart racing as footsteps fell in behind her. When a hand touched her shoulder, she nearly screamed. "Mrs. Johnson?" Josephine turned, relief washing over her as she recognized Mrs. Doyle, the boarding house owner. "You startled me," she said, trying to calm her racing heart. "I'm sorry, dear," I called out, "but you seemed lost in thought." The older woman studied her face. "Are you all right? You look pale." "I'm fine, just tired." Josephine forced a smile. "Was there something you needed?" "Yes, actually. A telegram arrived for your husband this morning." Mrs. Doyle pulled an envelope from her pocket. "I thought I'd save the messenger a trip." Josephine took the envelope with a murmured thank you, her mind racing. They hadn't told anyone where they were staying, had used false names. Who could possibly be sending Flynn a telegram? She hurried back to the boarding house, finding Flynn in their room cleaning the revolver he'd purchased the day before. "This came for you," she said, handing him the envelope. "Or rather, for Frank Johnson." Flynn frowned, setting aside the gun to open the telegram. His expression darkened as he read. "What is it?" Josephine asked, anxiety tightening her chest. "It's from Clay Clayton, my former employer." Flynn handed her the paper. "Somehow he found us." The telegram was brief. "Blackman offering 1,000 for girl, stop 500 for you dead or alive, stop not safe in Denver, stop heading north tomorrow morning, stop, we'll meet halfway, CC, he's helping us," Josephine said, surprised. Flynn nodded. "Clay's a good man. I worked his ranch for 2 years. He must have guessed where we'd go." He began gathering their belongings. "If Clay knows we're here, others might too. We need to leave. Tonight." They packed quickly, abandoning items that weren't essential. Flynn went out to secure a wagon and team while Josephine settled their bill with Mrs. Doyle, explaining that urgent family business required them to depart immediately. By midnight, they were on the road north, the lights of Denver fading behind them. The wagon was loaded with their supplies, a canvas cover providing some protection from the elements. Flynn handled the team with practiced ease, keeping the horses at a steady pace through the darkness. "Will we meet your friend?" Josephine asked as they traveled. "This Clayton person," Clay said halfway. There's a trading post about a week's journey from here near the Kashla Powder River. My guess is that's where he'll be waiting. Flynn glanced at her. You'll like him. He's gruff but fair. Gave me a chance when others wouldn't. They traveled steadily for the next 5 days, camping alongside the road each night. The terrain gradually changed from rolling plains to more rugged country as they moved northward. The days grew cooler, the nights downright cold, and they huddled together for warmth in the back of the wagon, a new intimacy developing between them as the journey progressed. On the 6th day, as they were breaking camp, Flynn suddenly went still, his head tilted as if listening. What is it? Josephine asked, instantly alert to the tension in his posture. Riders, he said quietly, coming fast from the south. They hurried to pack the remaining items, but before they could finish, 3 horsemen appeared on the road behind them. Even at a distance, Josephine recognized the massive form of Victor Blackman at the lead. Get in the wagon, Flynn ordered, helping her up before grabbing his rifle. If anything happens to me, keep driving north. Don't stop until you reach the trading post. Ask for Clay Clayton. Nothing's going to happen to you, Josephine said fiercely, but her voice shook. Flynn squeezed her hand once, then turned to face the approaching riders, rifle at the ready. Josephine took up the reins, prepared to flee if necessary, but unwilling to leave Flynn behind. The riders slowed as they approached, spreading out slightly. Blackman in the center, Denton and another man Josephine didn't recognize flanking him. Their horses were lathered with sweat, clearly pushed hard to catch up. Jackson, Blackman called, bringing his horse to a halt about 20 yards away. This has gone on long enough. I agree, Flynn replied evenly, though Josephine could see the tension in every line of his body. Turn around and go home, Blackman. She's not yours. Blackman's laugh was ugly. A woman promised to me by her father, stolen by a saddled tramp. You think that stands in any court? His eyes shifted to Josephine, and she shivered at the cold fury she saw there. Come back now, girl, and maybe I won't kill him. I was never yours to begin with, Josephine called back, surprising herself with her steadiness. And I never will be. Blackman's face darkened. Have it your way. He nodded to his men. Kill Jackson, the girl comes with us. Everything happened at once. The men spurred their horses forward as Flynn raised his rifle. A shot rang out, but not from Flynn's gun. The man to Blackman's left jerked in his saddle and fell, a bloom of red spreading across his chest. More shots came from the ridge above them, forcing Blackman and Denton to retreat. A voice called out from the rocks. That's far enough, Victor. A rider emerged from behind the ridge, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a weathered face. He was followed by 4 others, all armed. Clayton, Flynn breathed, relief evident in his voice. The newcomer rode down to join them, keeping a wary eye on Blackman and Denton, who had pulled back to a safe distance. You're a hard man to find, Jackson, Clay Clayton said, dismounting beside Flynn. Glad I caught up with you before these vultures did. Your timing is impeccable, Flynn replied, clapping the older man on the shoulder. How did you know? Been tracking you since I sent that telegram. Figured Blackman would be doing the same. Clayton turned to Josephine. You must be the young lady worth all this trouble. Clay Clayton, madam, pleasure to meet you. Josephine liked him immediately, his direct manner, the respect in his eyes as he addressed her. Josephine Palmer, thank you for helping us. Clayton nodded, then turned his attention back to Blackman, who remained at a distance, clearly reassessing the situation now that the odds had shifted. You're outnumbered, Victor, Clayton called. Take your man and go home. The girl's made her choice. This isn't over, Blackman snarled. That's my property you're protecting. She's not property, Flynn said, his voice hard. She's a woman who deserves better than being traded like cattle to settle a debt. For a tense moment, it seemed Blackman might charge them despite the odds. Then, with a curse, he yanked his horse around. This isn't over, Jackson, not by a long shot. He and Denton galloped away, leaving their fallen companion behind. Clayton's men confirmed the man was dead and covered him with a blanket from their supplies. They would take him to the nearest town for proper burial. Clayton explained, while he continued north with Flynn and Josephine. That night, camped beside a small creek with Clayton's men keeping watch, Flynn and Josephine sat with the rancher around a small fire, sharing the story of their escape and journey. "So that land near the Wyoming line," Clayton said when they had finished. "That's where you're heading." Flynn nodded. "I've had my eye on it for a while now, thought I might settle there someday." Clayton studied them both. "It's good land, isolated though, hard winters." His eyes settled on Josephine. "Not an easy life for a woman used to town living." "I'm stronger than I look," Josephine said. "And I'm a quick learner." Clayton's weathered face creased in a smile. "I believe you are at that." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a leather pouch, which he tossed to Flynn. "Your wages for the last 2 seasons. Never did get around to paying you proper before all this excitement." Flynn opened the pouch, his eyes widening at the gold coins inside. "Clay, this is more than I earned. Consider it a wedding gift," Clayton replied with a wink, "assuming that's where this is headed." Josephine felt her cheeks warm as Flynn glanced at her, a question in his eyes that made her heart skip. "Yes," she said softly, "I believe it is." Clayton accompanied them as far as the Wyoming border, where they parted ways with handshakes and promises to visit when they were settled. The rancher left them with additional supplies, including a milk cow that would prove invaluable in the months ahead. "Blackman won't give up easily," Clayton warned as they said their goodbyes. "He's not a man who forgets a slight." "We'll be careful," Flynn assured him. "And once we're established, we'll send word." The land, when they finally reached it after 2 more weeks of travel, was everything Flynn had described: a natural basin sheltered by mountains to the west, with a clear creek running through stands of aspen and pine. A meadow stretched toward the east, rich with grass that would feed their small herd. It was wild, untamed, beautiful in its rugged simplicity. They set to work immediately, knowing winter would soon be upon them. Flynn cut logs for a cabin while Josephine established their camp and began clearing land for a garden come spring. They worked from dawn until dusk, falling into exhausted sleep each night in the wagon. By the time the first snow fell in late October, they had a small but sturdy cabin with a stone fireplace, a barn for the animals, and enough firewood stacked to last the winter. They had also become husband and wife, married by a circuit preacher who had passed through the nearest settlement, a tiny collection of cabins 20 miles to the east. Their wedding had been simple: Josephine in her best dress, Flynn in a clean shirt, the preacher reading from a worn Bible as a handful of settlers looked on. The words they spoke to each other, though, were anything but simple promises of love, respect, and partnership that moved both of them to tears. "I never thought I'd find this," Flynn had whispered as they danced under the stars that night, their only music the humming of the settlers' wives and the distant howling of wolves. "Someone who sees me for who I really am, who chooses me freely." "I never thought I'd be allowed to choose at all," Josephine had replied, her head against his chest. "You gave me that gift, Flynn, the freedom to decide my own future." That winter tested them in ways neither had anticipated. The snow fell heavily, sometimes trapping them indoors for days. The temperatures dropped so low that ink froze in its bottle and their breath crystallized in the air even inside the cabin. Food had to be carefully rationed, firewood conserved, but there were gifts in that isolation too. Long evenings by the fire, sharing stories and dreams. Flynn teaching Josephine to play the harmonica he'd carried since boyhood. Josephine reading aloud from the 2 books. They possessed a collection of Wordsworth's poetry and a practical guide to homesteading that Clayton had given them as a parting gift. And there were the nights when they discovered each other as husband and wife, learning the language of touch and whispers that bound them ever closer together. Spring came late but gloriously, the meadow erupting in wildflowers as the snow retreated. They planted their garden and began constructing additional outbuildings. Flynn rode to the settlement occasionally for supplies they couldn't produce themselves and to send letters to Clayton, keeping him informed of their progress. It was on one such trip, nearly a year after they had claimed the land, that Flynn returned with news. "Victor Blackman is dead," he announced as he unpacked the supplies. "Shot in a saloon fight in Denver 3 weeks ago." Josephine paused in her cooking, absorbing the information. "Are you certain?" Clayton confirmed it, said he heard it from 3 different sources. Flynn came to her, taking her hands. "It's over, Josephine, really over." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Despite the distance and time that had passed, Blackman's threat had lingered in the back of her mind like a shadow. "I can hardly believe it." "Believe it." Flynn pulled her close. "We're free, to live our life, to build our home, to raise our family." Josephine looked up at him, her heart full. "Our family," Flynn smiled, a hint of nervousness in his eyes. If that's what you want, someday." "Someday soon, I think," she said softly, guiding his hand to rest on her stomach. "If my calculations are correct." Flynn's eyes widened, then filled with such joy that Josephine felt tears spring to her own eyes. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her around as they both laughed. "A baby," he whispered when he set her down, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." Their daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Jackson, was born on a crisp autumn day as the aspen trees turned gold. She had Flynn's blue eyes and Josephine's determination, and from her earliest days showed a love for the land that matched her parents. Over the years that followed, their homestead grew and flourished. They added to the cabin, built a proper barn, and established a small herd of cattle that provided a modest but steady income. 2 more children joined their family: James Clayton Jackson, born 3 years after Sarah, and Emma Grace Jackson, who arrived 2 years after that. They faced hardships, of course, drought seasons, harsh winters, the normal challenges of frontier life. But they faced them together, the bond between them strengthening with each obstacle overcome. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Flynn surprised Josephine with a gift: a small writing desk placed by the window that overlooked the meadow, and a leather-bound journal. "For your stories," he explained as she ran her fingers over the smooth surface of the desk. "You've always had a way with words. I thought maybe you'd want to write them down, for the children or just for yourself." Touched beyond words, Josephine kissed him, marveling at how this man still found ways to see into her heart after all these years. That night, as their children slept and Flynn sat by the fire mending harnesses, Josephine opened the journal and began to write. She wrote about a desperate bride standing at an altar, about a brave cowboy who offered her a choice, about a journey across mountains and plains that led not just to a place, but to a life she had never dared to imagine. She wrote about love, not the kind found in poetry or novels, but the real kind, built day by day through shared work and dreams, through respect and understanding, through the freedom to choose each other anew with every sunrise. And as she wrote, Josephine Palmer Jackson looked across the room at the man who had changed her life with one courageous act, and knew with absolute certainty that she would choose him again every day, for all the days to come. 20 years after Flynn Jackson rode into that church in Florissant, their homestead had grown into a prosperous ranch. Their children were nearly grown: Sarah engaged to the son of a neighboring rancher, James studying to become a doctor in Denver, and Emma showing signs of following her mother's literary interests, devouring every book she could get her hands on. The cabin had expanded into a proper house, with glass windows and painted walls. The meadow was now partially fenced for their expanded herd, and Flynn had built Josephine a proper garden with raised beds and a small greenhouse for starting seedlings in the spring. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson, Flynn took Josephine's hand in his. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't come into that church that day?" he asked. Josephine considered the question. "Sometimes. But not in the way you might think." She turned to face him. "I don't wonder if I would have been happier somewhere else or with someone else. I wonder if I would have found the courage to save myself eventually." Flynn smiled. I think you would have. You're the strongest person I've ever known. Perhaps, she squeezed his hand. But I'm glad I didn't have to. I'm glad it was you who helped me find that strength. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky. Their lives had been full of love, of work, of family, of the countless small moments that weave together to create a life well lived. Would you do it all again? Josephine asked suddenly. Knowing everything, the hardships, the struggles, the uncertainty, Flynn didn't hesitate. In a heartbeat. For you, for our children, for this life we've built together. He lifted her hand to his lips. Best decision I ever made, walking into that church. Josephine leaned against his shoulder, contentment filling her heart. For what it's worth, I think my mother would have liked you very much. Flynn chuckled. I hope so. I like to think she was watching that day, helping me find the courage to speak up. Maybe she was, Josephine said softly. Some things feel too right to be mere coincidence. As darkness settled over their land, they remained on the porch, listening to the night sounds of their home, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind in the aspen leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl hunting in the meadow. These were the sounds of the life they had chosen, the life they had built together against all odds. And in that moment, as on countless others over the years, Josephine knew with absolute certainty that this man, this land, this family, this love was worth every risk, every hardship, every moment of fear they had faced along the way. It was, quite simply, the life she was meant to live, with the man she was meant to love. And that knowledge, that bone-deep certainty, was the greatest freedom of all.